I'm delighted to welcome you to this joint meeting of the Classical Association and the Potteries Theological Society. As some of you will know, I'm here in two capacities, which don't clash, because I'm treasurer of the one and chair of the other. I bring apologies from Andy, who is busy at work at Manchester. So it's my pleasant duty to introduce our speaker for the evening. We shall, as usual, be sending the book round for people to sign their names. It would be very helpful if people can indicate whether they're members of the CA or the PTS, or indeed both, of course, if you are and wish to. I will talk at the interval about the next meetings of the two societies, but for the moment it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Shushma Malik, who is the Onassis Classics Fellow at Newnham College, Cambridge, where she's been since September 2022, specialising in Roman history and classical reception studies. Her research interests include Roman emperors in political culture and Roman historiography. She's worked extensively on the Emperor Nero's portrayal in Christian history as the Antichrist, and has published on portrayals of Roman emperors in the works and letters of Oscar Wilde. Her first monograph is called The Nero Antichrist, Founding and Fashioning a Paradigm. So, without more ado, I will hand over to Shushma. And as usual, we shall have an interval when we will look at the details, parish notices as it were, before we go on to questions and answers afterwards. Shushma.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, particularly to Stephen and to Chris for inviting me as well. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming out on a sort of slightly cold December evening, so I really do appreciate it. If anyone at any time can't hear me, just wave at me and I will try and speak a bit louder. It's not too big a room, so hopefully we should be okay. So I'm really delighted to be able to come and talk to you about something that I started looking at many years ago for my PhD, which I did at the University of Bristol, and have actually had the opportunity to talk about some aspects of it in this forum before, a number of years ago when I was a lecturer in the University of Manchester. So it's really nice to be able to come back and give you a little bit more of some of that material. So I'm going to focus on an emperor whom some of you may have heard of, the Emperor Nero. I will go through some sort of biographical basics as well, just to make sure we're all on the same page. But he is an emperor, I think it's fair to say, whose reputation goes before him in many ways. Anyone who's seen I, Claudius might know a little bit about what that reputation is. But perhaps one of the lesser known aspects of Nero's wide-ranging reception history is of his incarnation, as it were, as the Antichrist at various points in early Christian history. And what I want to do today is just introduce you a little bit to some of those instances of that reception, particularly in a period we call late antiquity, so from about the sort of late 3rd century AD onwards, and then also look a little bit more in depth at whether the early interpretations of him as someone who can be figured as an Antichrist figure that was in Revelation and in 2 Thessalonians, so particularly some New Testament texts, or whether that's something that perhaps was a later creation. So that's what I want to focus on a little bit more today. Yes, I think it works. So just to make sure, as I say, that we're all on the same page, it'll be easy for me to read from here. A few Nero kind of biographical basics. He was the 5th emperor of Rome, so we start with Augustus, generally speaking, 27 BCE, and go through to the 5th emperor when we get to Nero, so we've had Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, Caligula, Claudius, and now Nero. We're in sort of firmly the mid-1st century CE, So 54 to 68 are his dates. He was born in 37, and he became emperor when he was just 16 years old. So he was quite young at the time by certainly modern standards, but actually even by ancient standards. You know, the idea of going into politics at that sort of age is quite not something that we've seen very much of before. It's starting to change now. We're in the period of emperors, but that is still fairly young. One of the things that is going to recur a few times during this talk is that he is the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors. So he's the last of that first dynasty. After he dies in 68, there's a period of civil war that starts in summer 68 on his death, and then ends in 69 with the ascension of Vespasian, who's the next, who founds the next dynasty, which is the Flavian dynasty. But he's the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors, and our sources are quite interested in this because he's also then figured as the last in the line of Aeneas. If you think Augustus traces his heritage back to Aeneas by Julius Caesar, it's something Julius Caesar did as well. Aeneas' son, in mythological terms, was supposed to have been called Iulus, or had an alternative name, Iulus, and Julius Caesar, not only him, but he really pushed it, said, "Of course, that is me." The Julius, Gaius Julius Caesar, that Julius bit is related from the son of Aeneas. So through that, we get this idea of a succession of kings from the mythological founder of Rome. And Nero was the last of those. After that, it goes to a different family. The bit that perhaps you have come across in sort of wider culture and popular culture is that he's accused of killing his mother, Agrippina the Younger, in 59 CE. So his mother had been the wife of the previous emperor Claudius. Claudius wasn't Nero's natural father, but Claudius adopted Nero when he and Agrippina, shortly after he and Agrippina got married. He is also accused of killing his stepbrother Britannicus, who in 55 CE, and his first two wives, Octavia and Pompeia, in 62 and 65 CE respectively. So he has quite a history associated with his name, particularly in relation to his family. Another aspect of his profile that was deeply problematic to an ancient historian, by which I mean historians writing about Nero's reign sort of in the 2nd century CE and onwards, was that he didn't pay enough attention to being an emperor, right? He would rather be an actor on the stage, he'd rather drive in a chariot and spend his time at the games. He was far too interested in Greece. He was a Hellenophile. We'll come back to that towards the end as well. And instead of spending time in Rome, he goes off to Greece in 66, which is a little bit problematic, considering he should really be in Rome doing the business of being an emperor, but he goes off to take part in the games. He's also accused of setting fire to Rome in 64 CE, and again this is something that our sources are a bit conflicted about. Some of them are absolutely sure it's Nero's fault, others of them say, well, there was a rumour that it might have been Nero. So, you know, we can think about that a little bit more as we go through the talk as well. But tied to the idea that he set fire to Rome is that in the aftermath of that, whether Nero set it or not, there was that rumour that Nero set the fire, and in order to quell that rumour, one of our historians tells us that he singled out a group of Christians as responsible, and that led to the first, him being labelled as the first persecutor of Christians. And that happened in around late 64, 65. The fire was in the summer of 64, and that's in the aftermath of that. He takes his own life at the age of 31 with the age of one of his freedmen named Epaphroditus, and that comes after he's clearly fallen out of favour with the Senate, with the army as well. That's really important. The army turns against him and decide they want someone else to be the emperor, which is Galba, who's stationed in Spain at the time, so his life ends very early, right, at the age of 31, even by Roman standards. If you think Augustus lived to the age of 76 and Tiberius to 77, actually, nearly 78, but 77. and Claudius managed to reach quite an old age as well. He is more in line with Caligula, who lasted to about 29, I think. He became emperor when he was 25, so roughly sort of similar with that. So that's sort of some basics about Nero, but like I say, I want to think a little bit more, not only about how he is understood in the sort of historical sources we have, so Tacitus, Suetonius, who are writing about him from what we might call the pagan tradition, as it were, but also a little bit in terms of the Christian tradition as well. But to give you a flavour of that pagan tradition, to start off with, so this is just a bit from fairly early on in his life in the account by Suetonius. So Suetonius is writing in around the 130s-ish CE, so a few generations after Nero's death, about 70 years or so, no, less than that, 60 years or so after Nero's death. Suetonius is a member of the imperial court of Hadrian, quite probably, and he writes biographies of emperors. So starting with Julius Caesar, who of course wasn't an emperor, but goes from Julius Caesar through to Domitian at the end of the 1st century CE. And he's interesting kind of right from the get-go, I suppose, because right from this earliest point, Nero is, in Suetonius' mind anyway, singled out as someone doomed to fail. So he says that Nero was born at Antium, just outside of Rome, 9 months after the death of Tiberius, who was the second emperor, on the 18th day before the calendar of January, just as the sun rose, and that he was touched by its rays before he could be laid upon the ground. So far so good, not so bad. Gets worse though. Many people at once made many direful predictions from his horoscope, and the remark of his father Domitius was also regarded as an omen. For while receiving the congratulations of his friends, he said that nothing that was not abominable and a public bane could be born of Agrippina and himself. So that's his father who says that of him, and also Suetonius says in any case. So the point here really is actually that in terms of shaping a biography when Suetonius is writing, there is only one way you can talk about Nero, and that's as someone who is doomed to fail. And that idea of him being the last of the Geno-Claudians, I think certainly plays into that. You can't create a good emperor who's going to put Rome into a state of civil war. In relation to that question of the Christians specifically, though, our source for this comes from Tacitus. So Suetonius actually doesn't mention a persecution of the Christians. He says that Nero punished some Christians. What he means by that is unclear. That might mean exile, it might mean something else. And he doesn't relate it to the fire. He just sort of has it as a part of Nero's attitude to Cassius Dio, also writing in the late 2nd century, early 3rd century CE, doesn't mention it at all, which is interesting because the version of Dio we have was copied by a monk in the 11th century called Zephylinus. So I think if it had been in there, it would be there. And that's something that Zephylinus would have paid some attention to, particularly because we have this account from Tacitus that is so heart-wrenchingly brutal in terms of the way that Nero deals with this punishment of the Christians. So just to give you a sample of it, he says, he talks about Nero, there were rumours that Nero had sung the destruction of Troy during the fire. I think so Tacitus says you can take those with a pinch of salt, but the thing that he does say is really serious is that to scotch the rumour that Nero set fire, he substituted as the culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christiani is in the manuscript. There's lots of scholarship about why there's an E, but we won't go into that now. And derision accompanied their end. They were covered with what, this is talking about Christians who were prosecuted not for being Christian as such, but for starting a fire. They were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses and when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Nero had offered his gardens for the spectacle and gave an exhibition in the circus, mixing with the crowd in the habit of a charioteer or mounted on his car. Hence, in spite of a guilt which had earned the most exemplary punishment, so the guilt of people setting fire to Rome, there arose a sentiment of pity for them, due to the impression that they were being sacrificed not for the welfare of the state, but to the ferocity of a single man. So this is a really key passage because it's the one that we have that really describes this persecution or punishment. Another piece of these will become less text heavy soon, I promise. Lots of reading to start with, and then I'll dial it back. But for another aspect of the way in which this idea of Nero becoming a sort of antichrist figure comes about is through an account that even after he died, he may not have died. So this is the story of the false Neros, and we have it in Tacitus. Suetonius mentions it as well, as does Cassius Dio, but Tacitus gives us, I think, one of the most useful pieces about it. One thing I will say is that Nero is not the only person in the imperial family to have these pretenders appear after he's died, people claiming to be him that come back. We've had it before this with a false Agrippa Postumus, who was the son of Augustus' daughter Julia with Agrippa. And we've also had a false Drusus, who was the son of Germanicus, who was a very key member of the imperial family, adopted to become the next emperor, but died, possibly at the hand of Tiberius, depending on which historian you believe. But the Nero ones sort of play quite a big role in his later understandings of him. Okay, so Tacitus says, about this time, Achaia and Asia were terrified by a false rumour of Nero's arrival. The reports with regard to his death had been varied, and therefore many people imagined and believed that he was still alive. The forces and attempts of other pretenders we shall tell as we proceed, but at this time a slave from Pontus, or, as others have reported, a freedman from Italy, we're not quite sure, who was skilled in playing the kithera and in singing, gained the readier belief in his deceit through these accomplishments and his resemblance to Nero. So someone who looks a little bit like Nero, played the kithera like Nero, sang like Nero, says, I am Nero, and tries to win support that way. So he recruited some of his deserters, poor tramps, as the translation has, whom he had bribed by great promises and put to sea. They caused some havoc, and particularly in the provinces around that area. Galatia and Pamphylia had at this time been entrusted by Galba, who's the emperor, to Calpurnius Asperus, who comes over with 2 triremes, and Calpurnius goes to Cynthus, which is where this pretender is, and where he had built up quite a lot of support, and just gets rid of him, right? The Roman army come, and this pretender is quite swiftly disposed of. However, they captured the pretender's ship and killed him, as you say. His body was remarkable for its eyes, hair, and grim face, and was carried from Asia to Asia and from there to Rome. So the idea is that he looked a bit like Nero, and he was taken to Rome to make sure people could see that this person was dead, right? And it wasn't Nero as well. Nero had died in 68, he'd been buried in the tomb of his father, Domitius, and given a public funeral, actually. So it was very clear what had happened, but this story came about in any case. Okay, and this story, along with that bit from Tacitus about the persecution of Christians, is really important because, like I say, they feed into later ideas of how Nero is understood in particularly early Christian texts. So Tacitus, as a pagan historian, you might call him, sees all of this as a little bit strange. Like he says, right, there's this person, it's dismissed very quickly. Some people were terrified by it, but actually he uses a very similar phrasing for the false Drusus as well. He says Asia and Achaia were terrified by the false Drusus too. So he's sort of putting it in a line of things that happened before, and he doesn't see it actually as a particularly difficult episode in history, let's say. It does, however, have an afterlife that makes that kind of story a bit more prominent. So we'll see that as we go through. But to start with, I wanted to show you the first, because Commodian is late 3rd century, probably early 4th century, so possibly died in the Diocletianic persecutions. Commodian writes a very, very long poem called Poem Against Two Peoples, essentially Jews and Gentiles is what he means by that. In it, he talks, the first time, I think, of the idea that Nero will return from the dead in order to be the forerunner of the Antichrist, or the Antichrist himself. So this is to give you a bit of that poem. Like I said, it's a very long poem. You can see the line numbers are 820 something, but it gives you a little bit of a flavour. So he's going to, his will be to terrorise his armies, to liberate nobility. So they're talking about sort of an Antichrist figure here, Commodian is. He who has been put in command of the kingdom and was known for a long time to have been preserved in his body for many years shall return from the dead. It has already been revealed to us that this is Nero, who had flogged Peter and Paul in the city. I'll come back to that in just a second. From hidden places at the very end of the world he shall return, since he was reserved for these things. The nobility shall marvel that he is hated, for when he appears they will think that he is almost like a god. So this is playing around with themes from Revelation, right? The fact that you have a false prophet who is mistaken for someone who is genuinely a prophet, that's why they're a false prophet. And also the idea that the first beast will return in order to herald the coming of a period, a millennial period in any case, possibly an apocalyptic period as well. So part of Nero is named in here, but also we get this reference to Peter and Paul as well, St. Peter and St. Paul. And this is part of a tradition that's sort of become quite firmly entrenched by this time. This is a bit from Eusebius, who's writing under Constantine, so early 4th century, in his history of the church. And he talks about how there's a tradition that Paul was beheaded in Rome itself, that's just this bit here, and Peter likewise was crucified under Nero. So Paul is a Roman citizen, he cannot be crucified. He is arrested according to Acts, arrested in Jerusalem, and appeals to be brought to Rome because he is a Roman citizen and can make that appeal. And he is tried in front of the emperor and beheaded as a result. Peter, however, was not a Roman citizen, and the sort of story has become entrenched by this time that he was one of the people caught up in the persecution of Christians that happened after the fire. Eusebius, interestingly, and I can talk about some more questions if you like, but so I don't think I'll have huge amounts of time right now, but Eusebius, interestingly, doesn't think Nero is an antichrist. He does think this happened in historical time, right, that Peter and Paul were killed in the 1st century CE, but he doesn't talk about the return of Nero as an antichrist, possibly because he's following quite a different sort of early Christian tradition to a writer like Commodian, who, to contextualise where they are as well, Commodian is in North Africa, so he's writing in Latin, whereas Eusebius is in the East and writing in Greek, so a bit of a different tradition. A bit later on, not that much later actually, around the time, end of Diocletian, beginning of Constantine, we get another text, again in Latin, Lactantius, writes a very interesting kind of set of episodes from history, I suppose, called On the Deaths of the Persecutors, by which he means persecuting emperors. So he starts with Tiberius, even though obviously Tiberius isn't a persecutor as such, but because Christ died under Tiberius, and goes through to Diocletian, essentially, so to his own time. And fairly early on in his text, he comes to Nero, and he talks about Nero as the first persecutor. So you can see there, he was the first persecutor, and that's really sort of Nero gaining this reputation at this point, or becoming entrenched in how he's talked about. So Lactantius says he may also be the last and herald of the arrival of Antichrist. He does say, though, it is not right to believe this. Lactantius doesn't believe this. He's telling you it because people do believe it, but he doesn't. He says it's not right to believe this. Yet just as certain as our number maintain that 2 prophets have gone away until the last days before the holy and eternal rule of Christ, that's Enoch and Elijah, that's a reference to Enoch and Elijah, but also we might say indicated there are Peter and Paul, but more kind of straightforwardly Enoch and Elijah. Until the last days before the holy and eternal rule of Christ. In the same way, they think that Nero too will come as a forerunner and herald of the devil when he comes to lay waste the earth and overturn the human race. So we have an idea of the first persecutor coming in specifically there. We also have the idea of Nero coming up. So we've sort of seen references to Revelation, particularly in relation to Commodian. I'll come back to that in a second. But we also have Nero being related to the man of lawlessness, or the mystery of lawlessness, or the mystery of iniquity, in John's, in Paul's, or pseudo-Paul's, 2 Thessalonians, second letter to the Thessalonians. And John Chrysostom, who's a bishop in, again, we're in sort of 5th century now, and he's working in the Greek tradition, also as part of his exegesis, as part of his explanation of why, of what's going on in 2 Thessalonians, speaks about Nero. So he's in his homily on 2 Thessalonians, he says, "For the mystery of lawlessness doth already work, or is already at work." He speaks, and that's a quote, his quote from Paul. He then explains the quote, and his explanation is, Paul speaks here of Nero, as if he were a type of Antichrist. So he's a bit cagey about it, but he also says elsewhere in a letter to one of his friends, he explains this as a reference to Nero as well. And this is the part of 2 Thessalonians for you. I'm sure you might very well, some of you might be very well familiar with this already, but 2 Thessalonians 2.2-7, "The man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work." So this is a text that still needs explaining in the 4th and 5th century, because we haven't come to the point of the apocalypse yet, and that's one of the things that John Chrysostom and other exegetes and bishops of this period are thinking about and trying to explain. And Nero is one of the ways of thinking about it. Not the only way, but one of the ways. Back to the Latin tradition, in the 5th century as well, we have another historian, but this time a Christian historian named Sulpicius Severus. He writes a range of things, but one of the things he writes is his Chronicles, which is a sort of universal history, but a universal history on the basis of a Christian theology rather than sort of a pagan way of understanding that. And he again, talks about Nero using this kind of vocabulary. She'll say, "I shall not say he was the worst of kings, but he was worthily the basest held the basest of all men, and even of wild beasts. He began the first persecution," so that same idea again. And also we get a reference to the Antichrist. So I'm not sure, but he will be the last also to carry it on, the persecution, if indeed we admit, as many are inclined to believe, that he will yet appear immediately before the coming of the Antichrist. Men leaving it uncertain whether or not he had laid violent hands upon himself. This is about how he dies. Certainly his body was never found. That's just not true, by the way. So I think it's supposed to know this. He's clearly read Tacitus, because his account of the persecution is basically verbatim Tacitus. The Latin matches almost exactly. Few tweaks here and there, but almost exactly. But anyway, it was accordingly believed that even if he had condemned himself with a sword, the wound was cured, and his life preserved according to that which was written regarding him, and his mortal wound was healed. That's a reference to Revelation, which I'll give you in just a second. to be sent forth again near the end of the world in order that he may practice the mystery of lawlessness. And again, we've seen how that's a reference to the particular language of 2 Thessalonians. So in this, it's sort of weaving together some of the different ideas that we've been tracking through. The first persecution, the idea of false Neros, that something tricky happened after his death, and then also references to New Testament texts. And this is the book of Revelation. Again, I'm sure some of you are very familiar with this already, but just as a reminder, this is a description of the first beast in Revelation, who is supposed to have a beast who has 7 heads. And one of the heads seemed to have a mortal wound, Revelation says, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marvelled as they followed the beast. Who is this beast? This calls for wisdom, says Revelation. Let one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. So again, a passage that perhaps is familiar because it's one that captures the imagination, has been interpreted in many different ways through history. One of the ways, an example of this, to how we can interpret it, comes from a book called the Liber Genealogus. This is a Donatist text, so North African again, 5th century CE, and this is the book of genealogies essentially. And in the Liber Genealogus we get another insight into the way that Nero is understood to fit with some of these stories. So the anonymous, we don't know who the author is, the anonymous author says, moreover, the passion of the Lord to the passion of Peter and Paul are 38 years. So that's between the crucifixion of Christ and the crucifixion of Peter and Paul. Or the death, Paul was crucified, but the deaths of them. They suffered when Nero was consul. The first persecution was of Nero, which is going to occur again under Enoch and Elijah. The Nero is he whose name John called in the Apocalypse 6:16, and then he says, here is this wisdom, Revelation 13:18, used that the name of him who is thus called Antichrist may be calculated through letters. So the 616 is a variation in the manuscript tradition, and the author of the Liber Genealogus uses it because the way that he, or she, probably he, anonymous person, understands how you calculate Nero's name using 616 here as Antichrist is A is 1, B is 2, so ANTICHRIST all have a number, and then you calculate, you multiply that number by 4, because there are 4 letters in Nero's name, and you get 616. It does work, I did check, but it is a little bit difficult because, of course, there are many names that have 4 letters. The more traditional way or conventional way to calculate it is to transliterate Nero Caesar, but actually Neron, so the accusative of Nero's name, into Greek, and then calculate it that way. This is called gematria. Oh, you okay? Sorry. So there are many different ways to calculate this, and the Liber Genealogus gives us one. There are other traditions that can work in other languages as well. But I'm sure you might know that a very quick Google search on the internet will give you very, very many different ways of calculating 666. So it's a very interesting one. But it's absolutely fascinating that in this early period, we get Nero being inserted into this tradition. Okay, what I want to focus on for the next, how long I have left, few minutes, 10, 15 minutes or so, is whether we buy this. So it's absolutely the case that in this early tradition, this late antique tradition, like I said, Commodian is probably the first to have that I can tell, to have named Nero in this sort of way. Was he really in Revelation? So you've seen the passages that they talk about. Is when John sat down and wrote Revelation, did he mean Nero? Or did he mean something that's more widely interpreted? Or was he very deliberately playing with ideas that could be interpreted in lots of ways, right? So was he meaning Nero precisely, or was it more that Nero was perhaps one interpretation of a number that you could, of a number of interpretations that you could use? And my personal feeling, I have to say, is that I don't think that Nero is the only way you can interpret these texts, these New Testament texts. And there are lots of reasons for this, but I'm just going to give you one for now, and then maybe we can talk about the others or some of the others a bit later. So one of the things that Nero is held up for, and this isn't just in the context of the early Christian tradition, I would suggest, it's also in the context of understanding Nero more generally, is whether or not we understand Nero as exceptional, right? I've given you the list, or some of the list, of the horrific things he does, but was that exceptional? And we might say that killing your family members, as horrific as that is, and as horrific as his instances are, was not necessarily particularly exceptional when we look at the imperial family of Rome. You only have to go to the numerous deaths that Octavian, when he was Octavian, put into place of people very close, almost very closely related to him, and just the senatorial aristocracy more generally, in as a way of looking at this. And he became Augustus, and we all like Augustus, some of us do, in any case. So there are questions we can ask. And one of the first ways that I would like to kind of start thinking about this is through the idea that actually in our literature, and we are relying, I've given you literature, right, as my way of coming at Nero. One of the things literature does is create types, right, types of people. And Nero becomes very quickly one of those types. So Juvenal, for example, in his satires, he's writing around the same time as Suetonius, so I think 130s-ish, 120s, 130s CE. And he's writing about another emperor who's died called Domitian, who was the last of the Flavians. He was also spectacularly unsuccessful as well. But he says, in the days when the last Flavian, Domitian, was flaying a half-dead world and Rome was enthralled to a hairless Nero. So Domitian is a hairless Nero. The way you understand tyrants by this point is through this idea that there's a particular type of person to whom you can equate them as a symbol of tyranny. Flashing forward to something that's sort of contemporaneous with our texts under Constantine, and perhaps even slightly later, is a great text called a great collection of biographies by a group of writers who calls himself the Scriptores Historiae Augustae, the writers of the Augustan history. It was pretty much conclusively proved in the late 19th century. This is one person pretending to be many people and writing this set of biographies that was basically a lot of made-up stuff, including some really interesting made-up inscriptions. But it's a fascinating group. But he is him, so singular, is slightly better on Elagabalus because we have other sources that we can compare for this. And Elagabalus was an emperor in the 3rd century, 218 to 222 CE. And when trying to describe how bad Elagabalus was, because he was bad, one of the things that this writer says is, his life I should never have put in writing, hoping that it might not be known that he was an emperor of the Romans, were it not that before him this same imperial office had a Caligula, a Nero, a Vitellius. Right? So this line of emperors who are all understood in this tyrannical way. He becomes a sort of emblematic of what bad rulership is in the literary tradition in particular, but that doesn't necessarily mean in outside of it. And one of the ways we can see different interpretations, perhaps, than the ones I've just given you, or understand them as kind of working within one tradition in particular, is that some of our historians do hint at the fact that actually there were many different ways historians wrote about Nero at the time. We just don't have them, unfortunately. They haven't survived for posterity. So Josephus, who's writing in the Flavian period, so sort of late-ish 1st century CE, says in his Jewish Antiquities, he says, for many historians have written the story of Nero, of whom some, because they were treated well by him, have out of gratitude been careless of the truth, and others, from hatred and enmity towards him, have so shamelessly and recklessly revelled in falsehoods as to merit censure. So you might be familiar with this. There are different ways you can talk about people, depending on whether you liked them or hated them. But he says, look, some of them, there were clearly very, very favourable histories of Nero out there in Josephus' time that were perhaps the result of sycophancy. But he also says some of the worst accounts of his reign are because are reckless falsehoods that people who hated him were responsible for. So there are different traditions operating, some of which, you could have read about the good Nero, perhaps. And similarly, Tacitus actually says this is a similar thing as well in the beginning of his Annals, when he's justifying why he needs to write this history. Our historians like to justify their work in these sorts of terms. So he says, the Roman people of old, however, have had their successes and adversities, recalled by brilliant writers. And to tell of Augustus's times, there was no dearth of deserving talents until they were deterred by swelling sycophancy, so that same accusation. The affairs of Tiberius and Gaius and as of Claudius and Nero were falsified through dread, while the men themselves flourished and composed with fresh hatred after their fall. So again, that idea that you have these different traditions operating within the way historians are writing history. Tacitus himself says, I will write without fear, without anger and without favour. Can you read it and decide if you think that's what he does? But it's a very, very interesting way of setting up his task as a historian. So that's a little bit on kind of some of the ways we might understand the historical tradition. And again, this goes a little bit again about the idea of exceptionalism. Is the worst of Nero worse than any other emperors? But at the same time, away from exceptionalism, what is it that people in the Roman Empire who aren't listening to the rumours that are spreading around the imperial court, right, which is what our writers are thinking of, like internal documents, rumours, gossip, those kinds of things, what do they see? What do you see in Nero if you're just living in the empire, working, trying to get through the day, trying to find, work and feed your family? And there are a few different ways we can start to get a glimpse of this, even if not, something that's entirely holistic. But I start with this image from the Sebasteum Aphrodisias, because it's in Asia Minor, in Turkey, and it's in the east. So if you think Revelation is addressed to churches in Asia Minor, in Asia, and that area. And this is a relief that was found in, like I say, the Sebasteum, which is a temple to the imperial cult. It's a temple to emperors that was built in Aphrodisias. And there's some great kind of articles and various things about this online as well, in the work that was done at Oxford. And here we have an image of Agrippina, Nero's mother, crowning him. Nero looking like a very promising young Julio-Claudian emperor. His iconography, like the way that his hair is, not on that screen. The way his hair is very, very sort of Augustan. The image of a sort of military emperor in the making, essentially, is what we have here. And while we might look perhaps with a more literary lens at Agrippina crowning him being some sort of comment that he was in debt to his mother. On the other hand, of course he's in debt to his mother. Agrippina is the great-granddaughter of Augustus. Of course she's also the wife of the previous emperor. She crowning him is not necessarily surprising at all, because it's through her that he has his claim to lineage. And interestingly, a version of that same image, but with more trappings of divinity for both of them, actually. There are some trappings of divinity for Agrippina here, so the cornucopia and the way she's dressed as well recalls the goddess imagery. And similarly, we have here too, but with Nero as well, sort of put in a more divine frame. And I don't know if you can just see at the top there's a radiant sun coming from his head. That's what that's supposed to be. But it's a similar sort of image of Agrippina crowning Nero. But this one comes from the west. It was found in Germany and it's still in a museum in Germany, in fact. And it's a very small thing. It's a little cameo, so a little sort of ornamental image of the emperor. But again, Nero looking like, we see cameos of this with many other emperors, looking like you would expect an emperor to look. Another thing we can point to try and get an idea of what people might have seen of Nero and understood of Nero if you weren't in Rome, in the imperial centre, is something like the inscription on the Parthenon in Athens. So for a while, Nero had his name on the Parthenon, which is quite an achievement, you might say. So this comes from the east pediment of the Parthenon. This is the recreation of the what are called triglyphs, so that you can see sort of the pattern of three going through the inscription that comes. Again, you might recognise kind of the meta piece up the top, and then the inscription, these dots is where the inscription would have been underneath. And through amazing kind of technology, we have, well, archaeologists have managed to create or get out this the dedicatory inscription, and it says, "The Boule of the Areopagus and the Boule of the 600 and the people of Athens have honoured the greatest imperator in Nero Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Nero Caesar Claudius Augustus Germanicus, son of the god, when the hoplite general for the 8th time, Epimeletes and Nomothetes, was Tiberius Claudius Novius, son of Velinos, and when the priestess of Athena was Paulina, daughter of Capito." So from those bits of information at the end, we know this was put up somewhere around 61 AD, 61 CE, AD 61, 62, and probably partly some historians have said it's a way for Tiberius Claudius Novius to get his name on the Parthenon, apart from anything else, by dedicating this. But it's also in recognition of what was going on in the military context, right? So the idea of the emperor and the military is really strong in inscriptions like this. This is a time when Nero is winning a war against the Parthians, not personally, but through his, well, it is personally because any general he sends out by this stage is acting for him. So he is, his general Corbulo is winning, has had some successes in battles against the Parthians, and they're fighting at this point over Armenia. Who should be king of Armenia, essentially, or who should be able to choose the king of Armenia, more to the point. And the reason why this resonates with the Parthenon, of course, is because this monument was built after the wars between the Greeks and the Persians. So it fits, because the Parthians are the inheritor empire of the Persians, so it fits that this is a place that you would commemorate these kinds of successes. Similarly, in Greece, we'll wrap it up now. Similarly, in Greece, we have some nice evidence from the time I mentioned that Nero spent in Greece himself. He went to Greece in 66 to 67, and during that time, in 67, he declares the province free from tax. He frees Greece, he liberates Greece. It's mainly symbolic, they're not paying very much tax already, but it's still an important symbol according to this inscription. So what he does, so the province of what we now think of as mainland Greece was called Achaia in the Roman imperial system, and this is commemorating what Nero does essentially to free Greeks, and this is a decree from Achaia in Boeotia. And there's also an assembly in Corinth and an inscription set up there as well. So this is this is a speech Nero supposedly gave. I won't give you read it all out, but you were subject, he says to the Greeks, to others or to yourselves. But what is Greece? If it's subject to anything else. So I grant you this gift in order that more people might enjoy this favour, and so forth. He says other leaders have it liberated, or liberated cities. Only Nero has liberated a province. And this idea of Nero being hailed, you can see at the top there, so he's Imperator, Caesar, Autocrator, Kaiser, declares these things. And he set up then in Greek iconography and in this inscription as well, as someone who gives freedom to the Greeks. So in 67, 67 we get, for example, this coin minted in Patras in Achaia, which has Nero on the obverse with a radiant crown, and on the reverse we have Jupiter standing there with an eagle and a scepter, but it's Jupiter Liberator, because it's a colony, it's in Latin rather than Greek. But also in Nicopolis, so this one in Greek, you can see the script around the outside. On the obverse, you have Nero in a small temple in Aegipta, and he's called a patron of the public. And on the reverse, you get Eleutheria. So that's liberty. That's the Greek version of sort of libertas, liberty, standing there, and the inscription reads, Nero, the patron of freed Greece. So he was honoured in this series of coinage in various places in Achaia. That's just two examples, there are others. And again, this sort of speaks to the idea of Nero being viewed in a very different way in different parts of the empire, where, like I said, where you're not in Rome, where you're not part of the rumour mill, but also in a way that also underlines that idea of exceptionalism. So this sort of vocabulary is, they're really commemorating something very specific here, but we see similar things being said of Augustus in Egypt, for example. So Egypt, of course, Augustus's favoured province after Actium. And in North Thebes, you get these sorts of inscriptions that we have preserved, again in Greek. So on behalf of Imperator Caesar, son of the god Augustus Zeus Eleutherios, to Isis, the most great goddess called Erutis, etc. But really here the point is that you get this epithet of Augustus Zeus Eleutherios, and that's Jupiter Liberator, right? That's the same idea that we've seen for Nero. And also in this one here, on behalf of Imperator Caesar, son of the god Zeus Eleutherios, Augustus, when Publius Octavius was prefect, and so forth. So these are commemorating particular events and using the name of Augustus as Zeus Eleutherios as a way to do it. My final example, because I realise I've kept you probably for long enough, is a statue. So all the examples I've just given you are while Nero is alive, but there are different ways we can see Nero while he's still alive. But I'm sure you will all say, wasn't Revelation written after he was dead? And that is true, probably, depending on who you read. Some people would say it was written much earlier than others. Some people say 67, 68. Some people say 68, 69. Some people say 80. So it sort of depends on when you date it. But this is an example that tells you actually there's a continuity in seeing Nero as someone with special significance for Greece and for Asia Minor. And this is a statue from the Antonine period, so mid-2nd century CE, right? So think of emperors from Antoninus Pius onwards. That's in Tralles, which is actually near one of the churches that's addressed in Revelation. And the inscription reads, Nero Claudius, son of God, Claudius Caesar, and it's the picture's a little bit slanted, but it's a bit of a book. But it's an over life-size statue of Nero that was put up in the Antonine period to commemorate him. Because Nero did particular things, or because someone wanted to show a connection to him, there are lots of political reasons why that might be, but it's something that someone put up and didn't think that would be a terrible, terrible thing to do because of Nero's reputation. So essentially what I hope that I've given you a little bit of an insight into, and I know it's a big topic, so it's just been a snippet of an insight, but hopefully it's been interesting, into some of the ways that Nero has been used in early Christian history, perhaps for very good reasons, particularly in relation to that bit of Tacitus and the account that he gives, but also in a way that assumes everybody in the Roman Empire had exactly the same interpretation of an emperor. And where I think the argument that Nero is definitely written into the Bible by John and by Paul, or pseudo-Paul as the case may be, falls down in the assumption that Nero can only mean one thing to everybody, that he was the absolute tyrant and that's all he was. So I think if you look around the empire and if you look at material evidence as well, we can find different layers of Nero and his reception too. So thank you very much.
pass it on.
Yeah.
Well, we'll allow Shushma to catch her breath for a few moments before we have questions. Just to mention the next meeting of the Potteries Theological Society is going to be held by Zoom, and it's on the 17th of January. The speaker will be the Bishop of Manchester. It'll be 7 o'clock. If I haven't got your email address and you'd like to be given the Zoom link, then do send it to me or write it or give it me tonight. The next meeting for the Classical Association is not until February. It's on the 29th of February, which is a Thursday. Dr. Joan Macelia from the University of Leicester is giving a talk on Ancient Greece's Next Top Model. And that will be here in Keele Hall at 7:30, Thursday the 29th.
But not, we hope, this room, I think.
But hopefully not this room. We hope downstairs in the common room in slightly more august circumstances.
And we're still looking to arrange one further, as CA members will know, talk this year, which is marked as to be arranged in April or May, and we'll hopefully have news of that in the new year.
So, do we have any questions for Shushma?
It's interesting to think about how transmission of stuff from one area to another must have been relatively difficult. So we're not in a situation of having one message going everywhere.
Yes.
Each area is generating their own, as it were, almost perhaps.
Absolutely, and so you do have imperial edicts, so things that come from the imperial centre that go out if there are particular festivals to be celebrated, particular laws that are going to be relevant to parts of the empire. And so you do have sort of that side of things, but that's official decrees. So the sort of official side of things that go out. In terms of the inner workings of the imperial family and the imperial circle, of course there's rumour and there's gossip, but that has its own particular geographical spread and geographical area. So if you look at examples from the Bay of Naples, where you have lots of emperors and their families going backwards and forwards, the rumour mill is fueled with all of these sorts of things, and you see it in the graffiti, right?
A bit like Westminster, is it?
Well, indeed. I mean, perhaps best not go into that in too much detail, but yeah, exactly. It's sort of an extension of the imperial centre. But when you go out to places like this, of course the things they're going to be worried about in relation to imperial rule are very different. Who's going to repair my road? Who's going to build, the port that will allow the grain supply to function properly? It's different sorts of questions.
Cost of living crisis.
Well, indeed. We do have a little bit of that in one of our, there's a sort of a local elite called Diary Chrysostom, and he does give a speech about the Roman persons coming from the imperial centre to come and judge us, essentially. Don't complain in front of him. I'll do what I can to try and get you, better food and better grain and all of those sorts of things, but just don't worry them about it. Inflation is absolutely something that affected the Roman Empire.
Mm. So were there any sort of state systems of censorship which could be stamping on stuff and stopping it from going out?
Yeah, so one of the ways one of the examples of that is a process called damnatio memoriae. So one of the things that affected Nero after he was declared a public enemy was that because he was declared a public enemy, probably less than 20% of as this also shows as well, of inscriptions and coins and those sorts of things have some sort of erasure on them. So it has his name, blotted out, or some sort of mark down the face, or those sorts of things. He's not the only one who suffered that, of course, there were other emperors too, but that certainly wasn't, again, the evidence suggests that's not consistent across the empire, and also not empire-wide necessarily, but there was a sense that from the imperial centre a message went out that
Don't believe this,
yeah.
Thank you.
Could you just fill me in a bit on the sort of Christian background of this this period? I mean, I'm afraid I'm woefully ignorant about how many, what sort of presence they had in the Roman Empire at this period, but also your reference to the Antichrist.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you can help at all from the Christian perspective. Was that was that a significant motif in Christian views of what was going on at the time? Because I think it's cropped up, hasn't it, throughout history? It's just something that perhaps doesn't really exist in more modern times.
Yeah, so in different ways, I suppose. But no, thank you. Those are excellent questions. So in terms of what Christianity looks like at this period, as sort of some of the sources suggest, it's very early on, right? So we're in the first generation after the crucifixion of Christ in terms of the Neronians, and what happens after the fire. There's only 30 years roughly between those two events. So at this point, and we can tell this from things like Paul's letters, right? He does write there's a letter to the Romans. There is a conception that there absolutely seems to be groups of Christians who have come west at various points, but I think it's fair to say that the majority of Christians at this point are still in the East. So because that's of course where Christianity started. So you do get groups in different places, but primarily it's in the East. There is debate amongst what actually, in terms of population statistics, this might have looked like, partly because we have very few population statistics for anything anywhere from this period at all. A little bit from Rome, but not actually very much. I mean, it seems, so one thing we can point to is a contemporary of Tacitus is a man named Pliny the Younger. And Pliny the Younger is sent by the Emperor Trajan to Bithynia, so it's Asia Minor, but North Turkey, so up in the north bit of Turkey. And when Pliny is there, he writes a letter to Trajan saying, there's this group who are causing problems, and I haven't seen them do anything wrong, but there are other people complaining about them because they are quite secretive and they're not participating in civic life, essentially. And also they're accused with causing sort of some destruction and various things. And he said these are Christians. And the fact that Tacitus and Pliny are friends might suggest why he's interested in Christians in his account, where Suetonius isn't, perhaps, but of Nero, I mean. But Trajan writes back, essentially saying, if you see them do something wrong, of course prosecute them, but don't respond to these anonymous letters. If people are sending you anonymous letters, doesn't matter, or you don't have to act on them. If you see them doing something wrong, then yes, do something, but as you would, but don't give into the kind of gossip and rumour, I suppose, that's going around. But Pliny hasn't heard of them before, so this is quite a new thing for him, having gone out to Bithynia, and this is the 2nd century CE, so we're now sort of about 100 years, just under 180 years after Christ's crucifixion, in around the 110s, essentially. So he as an elite Roman male, which is not necessarily the most representative of groups, although in some ways very representative of kind of Roman attitudes, hasn't come across him before. we do start to see more of a spread, I would say, from around the 3rd century onwards. And the reason why I say that is because in the mid-3rd century, as again you may know, there's a persecution. The first, so up until the mid-3rd century, around the 250s, whenever we talk about persecutions of the Christians, they're always localised, very much so. So particular problems in particular areas, like what Finney identified. But we have other examples. Marcus Aurelius, for example, there's a persecution in Lyon, in France, with Dunham, that our sources talk about. So they're localised instances rather than being anything sort of systematic or empire-wide. That happens in the mid-3rd century when Christians are, everyone is, but it's a problem particularly for Christians, are made because of there's a sort of crisis going on in this period, and one of the things that Romans tend to turn to when there's a period of crisis is the idea that you're upsetting the gods. So in order to show the Pax Deorum, peace amongst the gods, between gods and men, they ordered everybody in the empire to sacrifice. And by this stage, everyone in the Roman Empire has become a citizen. That happens in 212 CE. The Edict of Caracalla. So all citizens, which is everyone who is free, has to sacrifice to the emperor, and this causes a huge problem, of course, for Christians. Some Christians, and then you get schisms of people who do sacrifice and people who don't sacrifice, and that's where the Donatists become quite important as well. But so you have from that point more evidence of actually what the reality of sort of Christianity is from that stage, and also from this point we start to get Christian texts that discuss the problem of martyrdom. So Tertullian is one, again in North Africa, late 2nd century, early 3rd century, and similarly Origen in the Greek East as well, in Asia Minor, thinking about these problems of what does it mean to be a martyr, and how should you be a martyr? And that comes about because of these instances of forced sacrifice, essentially, during this period in a more systematic kind of way. And then you get what's known now colloquially as the Great Persecution under Diocletian. That's very early 4th century, so 300 sort of more or less spread on. Again, that is much more systematic in the East than it is in the West. So it's much more widespread in the East. And it's after the fall of Diocletian and the Tetrarchy that you get Constantine. So Constantine comes just sort of about 10-15 years after that, with the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, in 312, I think it is, Battle of the Milvian Bridge. So really from that point you've been sort of working up and trying to get a sense, but it seems like really the first kind of idea we have of widespread Christianity comes from around the mid-3rd century, so, which is also the time when we start to get ideas of Nero as the Antichrist. So to also answer your question, sorry, I'm talking a lot about the Antichrist. It's a really interesting question because theologically, I've been jumping around these different figures and calling them all the Antichrist, and which they weren't when they were first written about. So the first beast is different, right? That's a different kind of terminology. The mystery of lawlessness. What happens in the 2nd century is a writer called Irenaeus and another writer called Hippolytus write treatises in which actually they don't talk about Nero, slightly annoyingly, but which define the idea of Antichrist. And they're called things like De Antichristo, so about Antichrist and various things like that. And they pull together all of these ideas of an eschatological adversary, so an apocalyptic figure, and talk about them in terms of an antichrist, as in a Christ and antichrist, right, as in the lamb and the beast. So those things are figured in opposition to each other around that sort of time, and that becomes very much part of the way these things are understood. And also, and also interestingly, it's not just used in relation to New Testament texts. They also go back to Daniel and talk about the warring kings in Daniel as sort of forerunners and as a sort of hermeneutical key to the New Testament idea of Antichrist. So this is all kind of developing in around the 2nd century.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm reflecting a lot of what you displayed, such as what's on the screen now, is in Greek. It
Absolutely.
seems to me that Greek culture and the brilliant personification of the gods and their activities, their rebirths and so on, is a culture which has a very direct influence on Roman understanding of the world of the gods and their reality in ordinary life. Whereas in other cultures, there's perhaps not such a backdrop of that kind of conceiving how the world works. And it does go back very much to Greek culture, it seems to me. And even in Jewish culture, Jewish thinking, you get in the New Testament the talk of Elijah coming back. Now, he died many years ago, but here is Elijah being talked about by the disciples as a reality. And would you say this is all rooted in the Greek cultural conception of how the gods and the world work?
I think you're absolutely right. So you're absolutely right to point to the Greek East in particular, because this is kind of the landscape within which a lot of these ideas are being worked out as well. So you have obviously kind of Revelation being addressed to temples in Asia and Asia Minor, so in the Greek East. And also the, like you say, the kind of resonances in the New Testament that go back to the Old Testament and also go back to the Septuagint, right? The translation of the Old Testament as well, because the whole reason for the Septuagint was that in Alexandria there was this population of Jews who spoke Greek and they needed the Greek text. So there is there's a lot of kind of intellectual atmosphere, and actually Luke, the Gospel of Luke, is absolutely fascinating because of the way that it taps into Hellenism, particularly very Greek ideas, and that kind of goes through, depending on who you think authored Acts, in that same sort of style. But also when your kind of point about divinity and divinization and emperors and how they inhabit the world. Hellenistic ruler cult is one of the backdrops here as well. So if you think of the successors of Alexander, the Ptolemies is one example, where you have the language of divinity being infused from a very early stage with the idea of leadership and cult and ruler cult. And that's something that is being picked up on, the Romans very clearly know about it, but also Augustus develops his own idea of imperial cult. I don't think it's the same as Hellenistic ruler cult, actually, but he does develop his own idea of how that might work in Rome. And perhaps one of the things we might say that he's going back to is the idea that Romulus was deified, or divinized, I suppose. So if you read Livy, Livy in his account of the early history of Rome says, gives two versions of the story. The first version, which is the sort of Roman tradition, the theological version, is that Romulus, at the end of his life, was wrapped up and taken away by the gods. And he became Quirinus, the god Quirinus, and he exists within the Roman pantheon as the deified as Quirinus. So the other version is the Senate got really annoyed with him and stabbed him to death. So there are two different ways of understanding that. But the tradition is of the deification of Romulus in that way. So there is also sort of embedded in the way the Romans think of their mythology, in the relation to some individuals, this sort of fluidity between gods and men when it comes to particularly powerful rulers, essentially. And I think you're absolutely right. This is something that many texts are thinking about in different ways, partly through Jewish traditions, partly through Hellenistic traditions, and partly through Roman traditions.
Thank you.
I was interested, you said you gave a date for Revelation that was actually quite early, it seemed to me.
Yeah.
I mean, my vague memories, which of course do go back to when I was at school, so they are undoubtedly out of date, was that it was probably 2nd century, but they pushed it right
It's
forward
been
now.
pushed back, forward, you're right. So it It feels to me early 2nd century, I have to say, but that's just from my historian perspective rather than a theological reading. So there's a professor at Cambridge, George Van, he's a Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity, and he argues that Revelation, he sees Revelation actually written in the period just after Nero's death, so 68, 69, and he sees references within Revelation as relating to the reign of Otho in particular, because Otho in that period tried to bring back Nero. He put up statues of Nero and various things. He had been married to Poppaea, Nero's second wife, and so he argues for a very early date, but part of the reason he argues for that early date is because he thinks that Nero is absolutely written into Revelation. So there's a
it obviously makes a big difference in terms of the topicality.
It does, doesn't it? Yes, it really does. But no, and George and I have had many discussions about it, and you know, it's a very, very interesting subject. But there is a sort of a range, I think, of dates covered out there for Revelation.
So you pay your money and you take your choice.
Yes, indeed.
Yes. Any further questions or comments? I was also fascinated about these false Neros, who of course we know that any worthwhile monarch, whether good or bad, is believed to survive.
Yes.
And it seems not long ago that I was watching Philippa Langley hold forth about Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel, who she was quite convinced would have visited the tower.
Gosh, there you go.
So I think we have something to tell
on evidence that I found unconvincing, shall we say?
Absolutely. But no doubt she'll make a lot of money out of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you very much indeed. That's a very interesting evening. And so I hope to see people in the new year, by Zoom on the 17th of January, or in real life here on the 29th of February, or indeed both. And so in the meantime, let's thank Shushma.